In the early morning of August 15th, 1814, the British opened fire with artillery from the siege lines, and 3 columns of the British Army marched against the American fort. Commander of the American skirmishers has made a good decision to start moving his troops backwards. Terribly outnumbered, and certainly not able to compete with the massed fire of that entire British line. But he's done his job. He's slowed down the British advance and given the troops back in the fort time to prepare and get a good count of their British adversaries. Skirmishers also were encouraged to aim for the important members of the opposing force, the officers that are commanding the troops, sergeants who are keeping the troops in line, and also those drummer boys, or the means of communication on the battlefield. A cunning plan, lying down and letting the wave of British bullets fly over top of their heads as the American skirmishers continue to retreat towards the fort. On the very far side of the field, just by the tree line, you may be able to make out some of the British native although members of the Indian nations fought on both sides during the War of 1812, on the most part, the greatest number of native troops sided with the British. Though the majority of weapons that are used by the infantry are muskets, those smoothbore weapons that have very short range and very limited accuracy. And particularly the American Army made use of rifles, much more like the weapons that are in use today. They have a corkscrew groove that spirals down the barrel, so as the bullet comes out, it comes out spinning. So like a spinning football, the bullet flies in a straight line. You can actually aim with it, and it has a much longer range than the muskets used by most of the soldiers. So in the upper bastion of the fort, you can hear the more distinct crack of American rifles as they now have the range, shooting at the finish line and probably targeting again British officers, British sergeants, and those drummer boys. because of the general inaccuracy of the weapons used at the day, that a musket at 100 yards, so a football field away, if you had 100 muskets firing at an enemy who was also assembled 100 meters away, that you could only expect 6 of those 100 bullets to hit a target. So you had to be very, very close to inflict any sort of casualties, or, alternatively, have a whole lot of muskets. So you can see that very little in the way of casualties have been inflicted on either of the lines of infantry. Some of you may also be enjoying now the lovely smell of gunpowder in the evening. The sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal not only leaves a wonderful taste in your own nostrils, but because the soldiers on the battlefield here tonight actually have to open their bullets by ripping them open in their teeth, that by the end of a battle, the soldier can only taste the black gunk left in his mouth. Another Congreve rocket being fired off from the British line. It seems that it is flown right across the fort. Though it was very impressive to watch, Congreve rockets were notoriously inaccurate. They tended to fly around in circles, sometimes even coming back to impact around the place where they were fired. Seems the American artillery has got the range now. Fife and Drum Corps carrying on bravely. Of course, being behind the line, I suppose bravery is a little bit easier back there. The American commander keeping his troops within the protection of the fort, leaving his skirmishers out there alone on the battlefield. Now, I think any infantryman of any era will tell you that it's much better to fight from behind a 6-foot wall than to fight in front of one. So, of course, it makes great sense why the American commander is keeping his troops within the fort. Of course, the downside of being in a fortification is that if the enemy does get in the walls, there's not a whole lot of places to escape to. As these soldiers are not only armed with muskets, also bayonets, which is a 17-inch triangular steel blade, a knife that fits onto the end of the musket, turning it into a rather serviceable, almost 7-foot-long spear. Now, being a triangular blade, that if you happen to be on the wrong end of a bayonet, that wounds from a bayonet also make a triangular wound, which even with today's medical knowledge are almost impossible to heal. If you stitch up 2 sides of a bayonet wound, you tend to rip open the 3rd side. During the War of 1812, about the best thing that a doctor could do for a bayonet wound is to actually pour gunpowder into the wound, light the gunpowder on fire, which would cauterize, which would burn close the wound, and hopefully prevent you from bleeding to death. Unfortunately, the infection that often resulted led to a much slower, more painful death. And a majority of red-coated infantry, but now coming on the close side of the battlefield, you can see green coats. Members of a Ranger Corps, as well as members of the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles. as well as a small detachment of the Indian Department. American skirmishers retreating to the safety of the fortification as the British line gets a little bit too close for comfort. It is curious that the American artillery hasn't opened fire on the British line at close range, that perhaps they're waiting for an even more opportune moment. Scattered infantry firing from the fort itself, but again the range is not quite right. So far in the battle, we have seen the artillery loaded with shell, with an exploding shot, that as an enemy infantry unit so far in the battle, we have seen the artillery loaded with shell, with an exploding shot, that as an enemy infantry unit closed at close range, and the cannons would be loaded with canister shot. Basically a tin can filled with a couple hundred musket balls, turning your artillery into giant shotguns. It seems that the British line has moved into the ditch. American infantry retreating from the wall itself as the British attempt to scale the walls of the fort itself. As infantry close to hand, that the musket itself is probably more use as a club, and of course the bayonets fixed will see terrible use in close hand-to-hand combat. We got redcoats on the wall itself, redcoats, British soldiers into the fortification itself. Americans retreating back into the main part of the fort to defend themselves against the British infantry that have crossed the wall itself.
Hello.
Now, when an enemy army got within your fort itself, the day was pretty much over. As the chaos ensued within the fortification, it was very rare that a defending force could fight off troops within their midst. Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles moving into the ditch now. Small amount of fighting in the far bastion, the far raised gun platform in the American fort. As British soldiers move to encircle the fort itself, forcing the Americans to fight on a number of different fronts. I don't think there's any hope at all for the American commander. He's better off to surrender now before the bloodlust gets into those ferocious British soldiers. An army is forced to crawl through the ditch, up into the walls, taking terrible casualties as they move through the booby traps that the enemy has placed there for them, that vengeance is at the top of their mind, and likely no quarter will be given as passions begin to rise. Limited defensive fire now from the American soldiers as they move back into the fort proper to defend themselves from the British soldiers in their midst. Though at close range, some of that fire, particularly from rifles, are taking their toll on the British line. You can see the fife and drummers of the British line acting as stretcher bearers or perhaps looting the wounded. It seems there is no hope for the American commander now. The fall of the fort is inevitable. Oh, the humanity! What has happened? Some sort of American booby trap? Giant explosion in the far bastion, hurling the bodies of the British invaders through the air. British lines stunned, looking at the carnage of the troops that had made their way into the fort itself. Perhaps the ammunition kept under the bastion itself. The gunpowder for the cannon has been accidentally or perhaps purposely blown up, destroying the British beachhead in the fort itself. Certain confusion in the British line. They've watched their comrades take terrible casualties. So we see what remains of the British attacking force limping out of the fort itself. And the American commander takes advantage of this confusion, moving his soldiers back up, pushing the British off. British artillery attempting to cover their retiring infantry, as the British commander just moved his troops back to recover from the chaos of that explosion within the fort itself. The Americans pushing, taking advantage of the confusion. We saw dozens, scores of British soldiers enter the fort itself, though. Very few crawling back out of the ditch. Looks like the morale of the British soldiers has been shaken. Those soldiers are retiring much too quickly and enthusiastically. Thankfully, it seems that the American troops are not pushing the advantage. Seeming content to jeer and throw insults at the retreating British. Some survivors now coming out of the ditch, but not many. British line retiring in disorder, not even bothering to take their wounded with them. In the early morning of August the 15th, 1814, the British launched a three-pronged attack against the American fortifications at Fort Erie. Two of those columns met with complete disaster and were repulsed with very little fighting. But a third column, attacking the fort here, made it within the fort itself. But the bodies were waist high inside of Fort Erie. But then disaster struck, that just as the British commander felt that victory was at hand, a terrible accident. A spark from one of the cannons, a spark from one of the muskets fell into the ready ammunition underneath the bastion, blowing the entire bastion sky high. Perhaps between 200 and 300 British and Canadian troops never came back. Most of their bodies or what was left of their bodies, are now buried under a cairn on the far side of Fort Erie.